G'day, as you know I am Kaylin and today we're going to be discussing balancing. So I'm going to explain to you the basic balancing. Depending on your shift requirements, it might be that you need to write a script in order to handle the balancing rules. If there's multiple categories that it needs to include into this balancing, etc. So what I'm going to show you, like I said, is the basic balancing. So if we move on over to our configuration module, please ensure that your server module isn't running because it's you're making shift changes here. And then, as with the rounding video that we done, there's also two different types of balancing rules. You can either balance on a daily basis, or you can then also balance on a payroll basis, where at the end of your payroll you'll then take all those hours into consideration and balance those hours there. So on your daily shifts, if we just take a look then at the balancing tab on the left hand side, you will see that there's a few columns here and there's a add button there. So if you just click on add, now the first column that we've got is the category. So this is the category that you want to balance. In our case, we're going to take a look at our normal hours, and the rule that we want to apply here is that the employee can work 8 hours before he earns any overtime. So if he had to work short, he worked seven hours, he came in late for argument's sake, and he worked short normal hours, but he actually has overtime, it'll fill in those hours from the overtime before he starts earning that. You don't have to configure that. That's you can simply make it also that only if he works over 8 hours, or whatever your set amount of hours is, only then will it then send that overtime to the overtime category there then. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually do it both ways. If the guy is short, it's going to balance from overtime. If he's worked more than 8 hours, it's going to send it to the overtime column there. Okay, so the category that we're going to look at is our normal column. So if you just double click on that, the drop down will become available, and you can just select normal. Now the rate, depending on whether you've got multiple rates configured, generally if you're going to be using the the standard balancing, you would only have one rate, so that would be fine there. Then what is the minimum amount of hours that this guy needs to work on this particular daily shift? So in our case, we're going to make it 8 hours. And what happens if he hasn't reached that minimum? Where should it get the hours from? So now we're going to make it from overtime 1.5. Now depending on whether you've got then overtime authorization configured, you can actually fill it from the holding category first, and then it can leave hours in the overtime column which needs to be approved. Or you can say only once those overtime hours have been approved will it take it from the overtime column to fill up that minimum amount of hours. The same thing, you've got the maximum amount of hours, which in our case is also going to be 8. And what happens if this guy works over 8 hours? We're going to send this to the overtime hold category. In other words, I wanted to to be authorized in that sense. Or else, to keep things plain and simple, let's leave it on the overtime 1.5. Now important, what you need to remember is that if you are balancing from the overtime 1.5 column, just make sure that in your time slots you don't have a case that it is not matching up there. Like if you take a look at our shifts now, we've got excess before, and we've got our overtime, our hold overtime 1.5 here, which means that in all essence, unless I obviously going to approve those hours into the overtime column, it will not actually balance balance to 8 hours there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this in. I'm happy. I don't want any hours before the guy starts to be taken into consideration, and then the hours that are after he's worked, only once it's been approved, I'm going to take those hours and fill up his normal time there then. Okay, so that's your daily balancing. It's quite easy to set up there. You can go and configure multiple ones. So let's say your next rule is now you're going to look at the overtime 1.5 column, and you want it to have a maximum of 3 hours in. So now in this case, you're not setting a minimum amount, because he can have, he can have 10 minutes in overtime, he can have, whatever, half an hour, but you're setting it at a max of 3 hours. And once he's got a max of 3 hours, you're going to send this to the overtime 2 column. Okay, now because there's no minimum set there, this, it doesn't really matter what you set this to. I personally just prefer to keep them all the same there. It just looks slightly neater there then. Okay, so we've got our columns there. That's your daily balancing. And then also if we move on over to our payroll balancing, like I said, that's going to handle it each day by day on that specific daily shift that gets used. On your payroll shifts, if we take a look there at the balancing rules on that thing, it looks exactly the same. So what you can do is you can also add in one. You're going to tell it at which category should it be looking. Double click that. Click on your category, the rate that you're going to be using, what is the minimum amount of hours. Now let's say in this case we're not worried about a minimum amount of hours. You can work 26 hours, you can work 38 hours, whatever that may be. But I want this to have a maximum of 40 hours, and once it's reached that maximum, I want it to send it to the OT hold 1.5 column. Okay, so that's in your payroll. Obviously then, remember that this wouldn't be then 8 hours, because you're working on, whatever your pay period would be. And obviously if you don't have a weekly shift, let's say you've got a monthly shift, you're going to have to configure that, for, let's say, let's say 80 is 160 hours per month then. So whatever that standard hours is that you need to do, you can configure that. And that's balancing. It's quite easy. What it's going to do then at the end of the day, it'll take those clockings, take his hours, and calculate all that, and then run through these balancing rules and apply that there. So as I said before as well, if there is something that's more advanced, multiple categories that you want to add together, you would then need to write a macro script for that in order for it to actually balance then correctly. And that's balancing. I hope that you've learned something and that you'll join me next time. Goodbye.